Great to see everyone wherever you are in the world. We're glad you're here to learn with us today. Jews and Biblical Criticism with a great scholar we're excited to learn with. I also just want to call attention to two events coming up next week and in person. We have Rabbi Angela Bookdale coming in person, Mitch Album coming in person, and then our next two virtual ones, actually in Denver, Dr. Elias Sachs speaking about great Jewish heretics, and Professor Sylvia Brock-Fishman on Jewish women leaders for our troubled times. Today, we are excited to have Dr. Marc Brettler here. Marc Zvi Brettler is the Bernice and Morton Lerner Distinguished Professor of Jewish Studies in the Department of Religious Studies at Duke University and the Dora Golding Professor of Biblical Literature Emeritus at Brandeis University. His books, How to Read the Jewish Bible, edited with Berlin, and The Bible and the Believer with Enns and Harrington. He co-edited the Jewish Annotated New Testament and co-authored The Bible with and Without Jesus, How Jews and Christians Read the Same Stories Differently, both with Amy-Jill Levine. He is deeply committed to making the Jewish community more aware of the richness of Jewish literature from the past, including the New Testament, and to introducing academic biblical study to the broader community as reflected in the Torah.com, which he co-founded. I've known Dr. Brettler and admired him for a long time. It's a privilege to learn with him. And I'll just recall that based on a comment he said to me about Migdal Bavel, the Tower of Babel, I remember that I was a rabbinic intern, the Parsha of this week, in presence with him about 20 years ago. So with that, Dr. Brettler, welcome.
Thank you very much. It's really a pleasure to be back. And I so appreciate that you have education as one of the three pillars that is so central. I think all three of your pillars are crucial, but sadly, education often gets forgotten. So the real question that I'd really like to deal with today is related to the title of the book, which you were nice enough to mention, How to Read the Jewish Bible. And I would paraphrase the question because I was properly criticized for the title at some point. I do not want to say that there's only one way of reading the Jewish Bible. There have been many ways of reading the Bible throughout history, and I think it's wonderful to really celebrate the fact that according to Jewish tradition, there are Shivim Panim LaTorah. There's 70 different facets of interpretation of the Bible, each of which is legitimate in its own way. But what I'd like to talk about today is a particular set of methods which have developed over the last few centuries, where there has been a certain amount of tension in terms of how those methods can or should or might, and those are all slightly different words, be integrated into Jewish life. I'd like to share with you from largely, but not totally, from an American denominational perspective, how different people have dealt with those methods. But first, I really need to talk about how the Bible has been understood traditionally. And when I say traditionally, I really mean until the last 3 or 4 centuries or so. And a totally wonderful, very readable book by James Kugel, who was a professor at Harvard University, then made Aliyah and taught in Israel. The Bible as it was is about ancient Jewish interpretation of the Bible and about different assumptions that just about all pre-modern Jews had about the Bible. And unless you have some background in this, understanding what is so new about modern ways of interpreting the Bible will not be very clear. So let me quickly run through these 4 principles of Kugel. The first is that the Bible is cryptic. In other words, that you need to interpret the Bible in a very specific and sometimes complicated, using very complicated rules, and the Bible does not always mean exactly what it would seem to mean on the simple level. So, for example, according to traditional Jewish interpretation, and I'll return to the logic behind this point in a moment, when it says both in the book of Exodus and in the book of Deuteronomy and Shmot and Dvarim, that a Hebrew servant is a servant le'olam, forever. It doesn't really mean that person is a servant forever. The word le'olam, forever, is cryptic in some sense, and that means, according to Jewish tradition, that the person is a servant until the Jubilee year. The Jubilee year is once every 50 cycles of years after 7 sabbatical years. Let me actually skip to 3. That would be better. I'll go out of Kogel's order. And the reason that the Bible needs to be read cryptically is because the Bible is perfectly consistent. In this case, it is because the book of Leviticus, toward the end in chapter 25, has a set of rules concerning Hebrew slavery, where it says that at the Jubilee year, all slaves need to be released. So there would seem to be a contradiction between Leviticus on the one hand, when slaves are released on the 49th year, and Exodus and Deuteronomy on the other hand, where a Hebrew slave can be a slave le'olam. That inconsistency cannot exist because of rule number 3. The Bible is perfectly consistent, and therefore the biblical words sometimes need to be read in a manner which is not obvious, because rule number 1, the Bible is cryptic. And because of rule number 3, the Bible needs to be read often in a way which contradicts its simple meaning. Furthermore, here I go to point number 2 of Kogel. The Bible, and I'll phrase it a little bit differently, the Bible is a forever relevant book. You might see a set of genealogies and you're saying, what is this doing here? You might see a set of laws which is not at all applicable to the year 2025. The problem, according to this traditional viewpoint, is in you, not in the Bible, because the Bible as a book of lessons is forever relevant. And furthermore, rule number 4, which may or may not stand behind rules 1, 2, and 3, is the Bible is divinely given. The Torah, we'll come back to this, is Torah L'Moshe Misinai. The first 5 books are the Torah as given to Moses on Sinai, and the rest of the Tanakh, the other books, in Jewish count, there are traditionally 24 books in the Tanakh, in the Jewish Bible, and the other 19 are in some sense divinely inspired, whatever that might mean. And these principles stood for close to 2 millennia within both Jewish and Christian interpretation. They started to change with the Enlightenment. And I don't want to overdo the importance of a person named Baruch Spinoza when he was born, later Benedict Spinoza. He was excommunicated from the Jewish community at the age of 24, which when you think of that is really quite a trick. And the major work that he wrote, or that is relevant to biblical studies, is called the Theological Political Tractate. And this one sentence is unbelievably important in terms of understanding the history of biblical interpretation. He wrote, this is translated from the Latin, "Now, to put it briefly, I hold that the method of interpreting Scripture is no different from the method of interpreting nature and is, in fact, in complete accord with it." Now, Spinoza is unbelievably important, so important that I even have a Spinoza t-shirt, which I occasionally wear when I give a lecture that deals with this topic. What Spinoza is saying in this particular quote is that the Bible is a normal book, period. It is in accord with the laws of nature and needs to be interpreted in a natural way. Thus, to move backwards, it is not cryptic. It is not perfectly consistent. Like other literature, not everything needs to be there for the purpose of teaching us a lesson, and it need not be understood as divinely given. So this one sentence in Spinoza, which is not unique to Spinoza, is important to understand in terms of modern biblical scholarship. A second thing that is important to understand, which I highlighted down here, is that we really do have an issue, even as Jews, when we talk about the Bible or the Torah. The Bible exists in many ancient versions. And here I'm not talking about modern translations. I'm talking about ancient versions. The Bible, the Torah, starting in the 3rd century BCE, was translated into Greek. As we will see, that translation in some places differs very significantly from the standard Hebrew text, what is called the Masoretic text. And there is reason to believe that some of these differences reflect the fact that there was not a uniform Torah text in the 3rd century. This issue came to light, especially after the year 1631. A little bit of background: the Samaritan community has as their scripture only the Torah, only the first 5 books, not the complete Tanakh, all 24 books, and they are in a different form than what we have. I'll show you an example of that in a few minutes. And when the Samaritan Pentateuch or Samaritan Torah came to the knowledge of Western scholars in the year 1631, people suddenly started to wonder, what is the correct version of the Bible? So you could see we're talking the same period as Spinoza. So the 17th century is the beginning of the beginnings of the beginnings of the development of what is often called biblical criticism, a term I would now like to come to. It is a term that I dislike strongly because it is a term that is often misunderstood. People understood biblical criticism to mean that the biblical critics, I hate that term too, criticize the Bible and are only interested in showing what is wrong with it. Biblical criticism, the use of the word criticism there, is similar to the phrase literary criticism. A literary critic is not interested in saying what is wrong with a piece of literature, but wants to highlight what that piece of literature means. And that is the sense in which criticism is used in the term, or was used in the term, biblical criticism, and indeed in general literature of the term, of the time, critical and historical critical were well-known terms that were in no way disparaging. So this is a method which began in the Enlightenment and is still developing now. I cannot point to a single person who is the originator of biblical criticism, but the first serious book written with a title historical critical that deals with the Hebrew Bible is a German work by this important scholar Johann Gottfried Eichhorn, a historical and critical introduction to the Old Testament. And he, working in the late 18th and early 19th century, is often considered to be a father or the father of biblical criticism. Biblical criticism itself is often divided into several isms. I'll talk about these in a moment. Text criticism, source criticism, less important for us, redaction criticism. And sorry, there's nothing I could do. No one has figured out a way of talking about this ending with ISM, but studying biblical texts as ancient Near Eastern texts and as related and influenced by those texts. I don't know, should I call it ancient Near Easternism or something like that? And I would just point out that I'll have just an opportunity to illustrate this very, very briefly, but for many more examples, and I thank Rabbi Shmuley for mentioning this, please see the website, thetorah.com, which really does dedicate itself to making modern academic biblical criticism more available and accessible to the broader public. So let me briefly talk about each of these so you'll then understand how Judaism is reacting to them. Text criticism, which I alluded to a moment ago. You probably know Genesis chapter 2, verse 2 from the Friday night Kiddush. Vayichal Elohim bayom hashvi'i melachto asher asah. On the seventh day, God finished the work that he had been doing. But there's a small problem. Right? I thought God rested on the seventh day and finished the work that he did on the sixth day. And thus, it is important to note that the Samaritan Pentateuch, which I mentioned a few moments ago, the Torah is held by the Torah text is held sacred by the Samaritan community instead of Hashavi'i, reads Hashishi, reads the equivalent of God finished on the sixth day the work that he did. And similarly, the ancient Greek translation of the Bible, the Septuagint, the so-called translation of the 70, translates into Greek, and on the sixth day, God finished his works that he had made. So here I will just raise this as a question, and I'm happy to discuss this later in the Q&A, is what text criticism does in its first stage is to say, well, there is not a single text of the Bible, including a single text of the Torah. And after the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls, starting in 1947 and following, we really see black and white in Hebrew that in antiquity, from the 3rd century BCE on, there is not a single text of the Bible. And step one of textual criticism is simply to document these differences. Step two of textual criticism is to ask the question, which one of these readings is the best or the most original? And by doing that, you are assuming that the standard Jewish text that we have, what is called the Masoretic text, is not the definitive text. So you can see how the development of text criticism can be problematic within a Jewish context. The second ism, which most people think about when they talk about biblical criticism, is what is called source criticism. And here I would just highlight two central figures in the development of source criticism. The first one is Jean Astruc, French. These are his dates, who he was a physician with a very serious Bible hobby. I really wish there were more physicians who had as serious a Bible hobby as this guy had, who studied the Bible carefully and wrote this book, which was ultimately published anonymously in Brussels. This was not an easy book to get published, given what it said, in which he suggested that the book of Genesis is composite and is composed of two documents, one of which uses what's called the Tetragrammaton, the Hebrew name of God, Yud-He Vav-He, which we traditionally do not pronounce, and when it's read in public is pronounced as Adonai. The other, sometimes translated as Lord or the Lord, and the other is Elohim, usually translated as God. And he suggested that the use of these two divine names is because Moses, who was the author of Genesis for him, this is an important point, used two sources for composing the book of Genesis. He was Catholic. The earliest biblical critics were Catholic, something that most people tend to forget. So that, in some sense, was a beginning of biblical source criticism. This then got refined, and in 1878, Julius Wellhausen, a German Protestant, published in German a book, which eventually had the title and was translated into English as Prolegomena to the History of Ancient Israel, and is widely available. And in that book, he synthesizes source criticism, he explains it well, and he explains it in a manner which for many people, and this is going to be very important for this particular class session, was seen as anti-Semitic. He was a great professor of biblical studies in one of the central German cities of learning, in the city of Göttingen. But then eventually he left biblical studies. He decided theology is not for him, and he became one of the greatest scholars of Arabic literature. So source criticism starts from some very basic observations. And again, I'll just comment on this now. Happy to return to this later. If I look at Genesis chapters 1 through 3, and I ask some very simple questions. What is the order of creation in terms of man, woman, and animals? I will see that in Genesis chapter 1, animals are created before man and woman, and that in terms of animals, the birds are created before the land animals. And I will see that according to Genesis chapter 1, verses 26 and 27, man and woman are created together at the same time. Vayivra Elohim et Adam b'tzelmo, b'tzelem Elohim bara oto, zacharu nekeva bara otam. God created person in his image. In the image of God did he create it. Male and female did he create them. But then I start in Genesis chapter 2. I see that man is created. I see that man is alone and God wants man to have companionship. Then birds and land animals are created as unsuccessful companions for man. Then afterwards, woman is created as a more successful companion. That is a fundamental textual difference. Another fundamental textual difference, which most English translations obscure. Genesis chapter 1 through the beginning of chapter 2 talk about 6 days of creation, and God rests by Yom HaShavi'i, on the 7th day. Yet, the second part of Genesis chapter 2, verse 4 says, Biyom asot Adonai Elohim, and so forth, in the day in which the Lord God makes heaven and earth. That's a single day. That is a yom. Some translations try to obscure that by translating yom as time. That is fudging. Genesis chapter 2 is 2 verse 4b, thinks that this creation that it introduces happened in a single day. Or another very simple question. Everybody knows the child's song about the animals going into Noah's Ark by Twosies, and that indeed reflects what it says in Genesis chapter 6, verse 19, that Noah is commanded to bring Shnayim Mikol, 2 of each, Zacharu Nekeva Yiyu. Obviously, they should be male and female, otherwise there are going to be some reproductive problems. On the other hand, Genesis chapter 7, verse 2 says that of every ritually pure animal, habehemah tahorah, Noah is to take shiva v'shiva, 7 of each, and of an animal asher lo tahorahi, of impure animals, in other words, those not eligible for sacrifices, he is to bring shnayim ish ve'ishto, 2, a pair, a male and its female partner. Well, which one is it? That is a fundamental problem and difference. I'll just say, because I have the term redaction criticism here, I'm not going to talk about it, but what redaction criticism does is it says, given that there are different sources which were originally separated and have been edited or combined together in the Torah, in what manner have they been edited or combined together? Now, briefly, the non-ism part of historical critical study of the Bible involves the study of the Bible within its ancient Near Eastern context, which could only begin in the 19th century with the discovery and decipherment of literature from the ancient Near East, and the discovery that the Bible is very close in some places. And again, I'm just being very careful in terms that I use here, is that the laws of Hammurabi were discovered in Susa, where they were taken as a war trophy from Babylonia. So discovered in Susa in excavations in the year 1901. So it never happened today. They were published 1 year later in 1900, deciphered and published 1 year later in 1902. Now people would be very careful and spend 25 years instead of getting them out quickly, but this is wonderful that it was done. And it was realized that these laws, which precede the Bible, Hammurabi lived in the 18th century BCE, have many similarities to what is called the Covenant Collection, a set of laws which are immediately after the Decalogue. And you could see this. This is the parade example of this. The code or the laws of Hammurabi, laws, I should really have LH there, that's a better term, are on the left. Exodus is on the right. You could see that the first law is almost identical. An ox scoring a man accidentally. The case has no basis for claim in Hammurabi. It simply says here, the owner of the ox is not to be punished. That's case number one. Case number two, look at Hammurabi. The man's ox is a known gorer. Look at Exodus. The ox has been in the habit of goring. Okay. Case number three, a man's slave, a man's slave. Again, especially for those of you who might be looking at this at a later date, you can spend some time on this particular slide, and the correspondences are remarkable, and it would be very difficult to say that they are accidental, given that there are very specific correspondences in addition to the correspondences in order. So thus, it became clear as a result of biblical scholarship that the legislation in Exodus is in some ways based on the laws of Hammurabi, which presents very significant problems for what was a Jewish doctrine of Torah l'Moshe miSinai, a Sinaitic revelation of the Torah to Moses. Now, I would note that these methods of biblical criticism are always being refined and revised. And that's what I said in all the previous slides, that did not all begin with Eichhorn. For example, he did not have the ancient Near Eastern texts that were excavated later. So the Bible in the ancient Near East became a later part of what the historical critical study of the Bible is. And you'll understand why I wrote the last sentence on this PowerPoint slide in a few minutes, where I say that just because different ideas of biblical criticism are revised and reformulated over time, that does not mean that they are wrong. So to take a very simple example, the theory of gravity has been revised over time, right? There's a fundamental difference between Newton and Einstein, and even post-Einstein developments. Does that mean that gravity does not exist? No. The way in which the scientific method works, and here I'm using scientific in a very broad sense, is that there are hypotheses. Sometimes as a result of new evidence, they're rejected. Typically, as a result of new evidence, they are refined over time. And that certainly happened in the case of biblical criticism. I now move on to my main topic. How did Jews react to all of this? So when I talk about Jewish reaction to biblical criticism, I obviously need to wait until somebody after Eichhorn had begun to publish at the end of the 1700s, and to talk about Jewish figures who actually read German, which was the main language in which this material was written, and reacted to it. And the first person whom I know about who reacted directly to biblical critics is the great Moses Mendelssohn, the grandfather of the composer Felix Mendelssohn. And Moses Mendelssohn is often considered to be the founder of the Haskalah, sometimes translated as the Jewish Enlightenment. The Jewish Enlightenment was later than the secular Enlightenment, though it certainly was very much influenced by it. And he wrote a commentary, or helped compile a commentary on the Torah, and he wrote a general introduction to that commentary, which was called Or L'Ntiva, a light for the path. in which he says dogmatically, Moses wrote the entire Pentateuch from its first words, Genesis 1:1, to its last words, Deuteronomy 34:12, including the last 8 verses of the Torah. Now, the reason he says that statement about the last 8 verses, because even the Talmud debates whether or not Moses recorded his own death or not, or whether those verses were stated by Joshua. So Moses Mendelssohn, as the founder of the Haskalah, who is sometimes seen in some way as a liberal, was an arch conservative with regard to the study of the Torah. And he says, as you can see here, our Torah is exactly the same as the one Moses wrote. Nothing has changed. And this is an important half sentence. And what befell ordinary books did not happen to the Torah. The Torah is not an ordinary book. It has its own rules. It's as if there is some sort of hashgacha pratit, some sort of divine supervision that made the Torah never change. And he continues by saying, oh yeah, Christians can accept notions of biblical criticism, and they treat the Bible that way, with everyone contending against it and doing with it as he pleases. That's fine for them, but not for us, the house of Israel. Now, this is going to be a fundamental issue. To what extent, because that really is my question, to what extent can Jews absorb the norms of non-Jewish biblical scholarship? And he says, no way, not at all. For us, the Torah is a heritage. There, this book was written in Hebrew. The word is morashah, as in Deuteronomy 33:4, which we recently read. Torah tziva lanu Moshe, morashah kilat Yaakov. Moses commanded us concerning the Torah. It is an inheritance. It is a heritage. And as such, it is ours. We have a unique relationship with it. Our relationship to it cannot be the same as other people's relationship to it. It is unchanging, special, mosaic, and divine. Most people in the Haskalah, but not all of them, agreed with Mendelssohn. So this guy, I have to be honest, is a bit of an outlier. He is not well known. He wrote a book called Mavo El Mikra'ei HaKodesh, Introduction to Holy Scripture, where he says, we do really need to accept what the rabbis say. However, there is a set of scholars of the generations, learned in the ancient times, famous for their scholarship, and whose testimony is very reliable. Here, he is referring to non-Jewish scholars, and he is saying we need to consider, and he's one of the first to say, we need to consider what non-Jewish scholars say, and he says he develops a set of rules. He says that in terms of halakha, in terms of Jewish law, here he quotes from a well-known rabbinic dictum, you must not deviate from the verdict they, the rabbis, announce to you, either right or left. But concerning non-legal matters, the rabbinic sages and what they say is not definitive. And as such, you need not always agree with the rabbis. And he says, for example, and he's quite specific about this. So to give you just a bit of background, the story of David and Goliath in 1 Samuel chapter 17 exists in 2 editions. The Hebrew text is significantly longer, almost 1.5 times longer than the Greek text. And many people think that the Hebrew text is a result of an expansion of an earlier Hebrew text, which was used by the Greek translator. And there, Ben Zev says, the Hebrew text that we have is wrong. The Greek text, as preserved and is shorter, is more correct. So he is one of the first people to adopt, in a positive way, some of the notions of Protestant biblical scholarship. A place where you might have expected lots of discussion of biblical scholarship is in a very important movement which followed the Haskalah, which goes by its German name Wissenschaft des Judentums, in English, the science of Judaism, or the scientific study of Judaism, a movement which was founded by Leopold Zunz. Another very significant figure in that movement is Abraham Geiger, who lived more or less a little later than Zunz did. Zunz was not involved in religious reform. Geiger was very involved in religious reform, and you could decide reform is both with a lowercase and an uppercase R in that particular sentence. But Wissenschaft des Judentums, which had many, many practitioners, was typically interested in reviving post-biblical Jewish literature. Aside from a small number of cases, Zunz and Geiger, namely Zunz and Geiger, the Bible was ignored. One of the other exceptions is somebody who most people know as the great Jewish historian Heinrich Gretz, a street named after him in the Moshava Germanit in the German colony neighborhood in Israel, in Jerusalem. Gretz loved amending biblical texts. He loved saying that the Hebrew text is wrong, and he was not unique there. One of the very few Orthodox Jewish members of the Wissenschaft des Judentums movement is known by his abbreviation Shadal, Shmuel David Luzzatto, Italian. He was Orthodox, and he sparingly amended non-Torah texts. Let me give you an example. Again, something known from liturgy, which may surprise some of you. You may recognize from the following from the Kiddushah in the Amidah. Baruch Shem Kavod, Baruch Kavod Adonai Mimkomo. Blessed is the kavod, it's a very hard word to translate, of the Lord from its place. Shadal pointed out, and this almost all biblical scholars agree with, that the first word Baruch is an error, and it really should be read Birum Kavod Adonai Mimkomo, when the glory of the Lord rised up from its place. Now, please note, Shadal is an Orthodox Jew, was willing to amend very sparingly the Torah, but he did, very sparingly non-Torah texts. In this case, the prophet Ezekiel, even though this phrase was very embedded in the Jewish liturgy, he pretty much did not amend Torah texts. I now want to talk about, since this is an American podcast, though I hope people will be seeing it throughout the world, since when we think about Judaism in America, we often think about denominations. So I would like to talk about different denominational attitudes toward biblical scholarship, starting with the first two significant presidents of Hebrew Union College, Isaac Mayer Wise and Kaufman Kohler. There was a bit of an interregnum in between them. Two quite distinguished-looking gentlemen, though Wise looks a lot more jovial than Kaufman Kohler. Like, you've never found a picture of him where he is smiling. So you might think that Reform Judaism was always very liberal in these matters, but it was not. The founder of Reform Judaism, Isaac Mayer Wise, even though he clarifies what he means, says the Mosaic Code of Laws comprises everlasting and immutable laws, and Moses combined Genesis from documents, traditions, and monuments. It is Torat Moshe. It might not be God's Torah in a complete sense, but Moses is the author of the Torah. And he's very critical of biblical criticism. I mean, look at this. That which is called Bible criticism, and there he mentions a figure who is not well known, Merckx, but then Wellhausen, is actually a shapeless conglomeration of hypotheses, vastly more error and unwarranted assumption than truth, distracted, tortured, perverted, and disfigured, new and outlandish hypotheses piled so long, and I can go on. Okay, in case you don't get it, he really did not like biblical criticism, and he forbade the teaching of biblical criticism at Hebrew Union College when it was founded, and he was influential there for decades. His successor, however, Kaufmann Kohler, was just the opposite. Now, Kohler is incredibly important within the conservative movement because he is the main architect of what is called the 1885 Pittsburgh Platform, which offered a set of tenets for Reform Judaism. So if traditional Judaism had Maimonides' 13 principles, for many years, starting in the late 19th century, Reform Judaism had a set of platforms. The longest lasting of them was the Pittsburgh Platform. And there too, he talks about biblical criticism, and he says, we hold that the modern discoveries of scientific researches in the domain of nature and history are not antagonistic to the doctrines of Judaism, the Bible reflecting the primitive ideas of its own age, and at times clothing its conception of divine providence and justice with men, dealing with men in miraculous narratives. And he says in other places, even more explicitly, we cannot escape the conclusions of higher criticism. And he talks about the importance of biblical criticism, while at the same time noting that biblical criticism is the result of the postulates and pretensions of Jew-hating Christianity. Now, this raises a fundamental problem, which is going to be a bit of a theme of this talk. How can Jews adopt something which has been so important in terms of Jew hatred? Now, that especially was important for Kohler's contemporary, the great scholar of Jewish studies, Solomon Schechter, who in the very early 20th century emigrated from England, who was not born in England, to New York as a very significant figure who is not the founder of the Jewish Theological Seminary, but in some ways he was the first significant figure and intellect of Jewish Theological Seminary. In retrospect, he's seen as both the founder of the seminary and the founder of conservative Judaism. He did not imagine himself as founding a new movement. This can only really be seen in retrospect. And he wrote a very famous article called Higher Criticism, Higher Anti-Semitism. If you look up Schechter, Higher Criticism, Higher Anti-Semitism online, you'll be able to read it. And in that article, he reacts both to the anti-Semitic prolegomena of Julius Wellhausen and to a very timely controversy of 1902, where a very important German scholar of the ancient Near Eastern biblical studies, Friedrich Delitzsch, was involved in something called the Bible-Babel controversy, where he gave a set of 3 lectures, 2 of them in 1902, 1 in 1903, very public lectures. The German Emperor Wilhelm II was in the audience, and Delitzsch claimed that the Bible is totally a derivative work. It knows ancient Near Eastern literature. Delitzsch was very involved in the publication of Mesopotamian texts, and it is derivative. And this was very, very difficult for people like Schechter to tolerate. So thus, in his address, Schechter says, the genesis of this higher anti-Semitism is terrible, and it's contemporaneous with the genesis of the so-called higher criticism of the Bible. It is full of venom that the Prussian government loves. It is attacking our sole raison d'etre. In other words, in contrast to Kaufmann Kohler, his contemporary, who appreciated biblical criticism, Schechter is saying most biblical criticism is anti-Semitic, that anti-Semitic biblical criticism is terrible, but nevertheless is saying, and this is from the end of his talk, which he gave, Kaufmann Kohler was in the audience, is saying we have to create a new great living literature for ourselves, which includes somehow the critical study of the Bible. Exactly how that should be done, he does not state. Let me now move on to the Orthodox perspective. Now I see pictures of some of you, and some of you who I'm seeing, probably like me, grew up with this blue book in your synagogue pews, the Hertz Pentateuch. I certainly grew up with it, and for a while it was widely used in all of the movements in Judaism until eventually, starting in 1981, when the Reform movement put together the Pentateuch, and then 2001, the Conservative movement put together the Eitz Chaim. This was the standard Bible with commentary. Rabbi Joseph Herman Hertz was the chief rabbi of the British Empire, when there was a British Empire, tremendously influential. And his attitude concerning biblical criticism is, it is totally wrong. He asks, and this goes back to something that I said earlier, are there possibly two accounts of creation? No way. Is it possible that the Code of Hammurabi influenced the laws in Exodus? Mosaic law in no way indebted. Absolutely impossible. Deuteronomy, was it written after the time of Moses? No way. He is claiming that discoveries from the very beginning of the 20th century confirm the antiquity of Deuteronomy. I will just say that in a variety of ways, Hertz is very, very good at manipulating evidence. Let me just bring this to a close. As usual, I'm not able to get through an entire slideshow. I've been teaching for 40 years, and I'm still terrible at time management to show the influence of these folks. And just to discuss very briefly the beginning of the flowering of real Jewish biblical scholarship. This could not happen anywhere but in the land of Israel, because in Germany, Jews were not allowed to be part of the study and the teaching, especially the teaching of Bible, because the Bible was taught either in Protestant or in Catholic schools of theology, and Jews obviously were neither. In America, until after World War II, and I'm happy to discuss this in the Q&A, Jews were often kept out of academia, something that is very easy to forget in the year 2025, and certainly were kept out of religious studies, and certainly were kept out of biblical studies. In secular universities, where it really was, in the sense, odd, in secular universities, only Protestants could teach the Bible. So when the Hebrew University was founded in 1925, that was a natural place to develop the Jewish perspectives of critical Hebrew biblical studies. This fellow, Professor Rabbi Felix Perlis, was one of the first people to do it in a very significant address he gave when he was teaching in Jerusalem at the Hebrew University in spring semester of 1927, which has the Hebrew title, Ma lanu madah hamikra? Why should the scientific study of the Bible matter to us? In which he says it better matter to us. It is incumbent upon us. He has phenomenal images that he uses here. He says that the person who is afraid of it is like a child who is afraid that a doctor will cause him pain with a scalpel and does not realize that the scalpel is saving him from much greater pain. Jews need biblical scholarship. And he concludes this address, as many other people did in addresses from the 1920s related to Hebrew University, with the phrase, Ki mitzion tetzei Torah. Torah shall come forth from Zion. Now, that most people who use that image, such as the Ashkenazi rabbi of Mandatory Palestine, Rav Kook, understood that to mean, traditional study of the Bible is going to come forth from Jerusalem. For Perlis, this meant no. Jewish critical study of the Bible needs to come forth from Jerusalem. Perlis is a central figure 100 years ago in encouraging Jewish historical critical study of the Bible, and his conclusions have largely been accepted. And over the last 100 years, we have seen a remarkable entry of Jews into the critical study of the Bible. Now, not everyone has agreed with that. So to take two people, one alive, one who died about 20 years ago, James Kugel, whom I mentioned earlier, he thinks that biblical scholarship and traditional Judaism are irreconcilable. Louis Jacobs, in his book, We Have Reason to Believe, says that they can be fully reconcilable. And for those of you who are more interested in traditional Judaism and biblical criticism, I just recommend these two books, The Bible and the Modern Study, The Believer and the Modern Study of the Bible, and a book which I'm co-author. It sounds like a bad joke, where a Jew, a Protestant, and a Catholic walk into a bar together and decided to write a book. But the Jewish chapter on the Bible and the Believer has a section on various ways in which Judaism has related with historical, critical, biblical study. There's a bit of time left for some questions. Other people are welcome to email me questions. There is my email, and I really thank you for listening to me.
Thank you, Dr. Marc Brettler. It was very insightful, very in-depth discussion. We do have a few minutes for any questions or any comments, so feel free to raise your hand or put in the chat, and we will call on you.
Thank you, Marc. I've read your work, and I love the Torah.com and
Thank you.
The depth. The last source that you mentioned, The Believer and the Modern Study of the Bible, or The Bible and the Believer, was that a book that you wrote?
Okay, so The Bible and the Believer, I wrote the section on Judaism in that. The Believer in the Modern Study of the Bible, I have a chapter in that particular book. And one of the very nice things about this book, and the book is available for free online, is it gives traditional Jewish viewpoints that are precursors and show some sympathy to biblical scholarship. So that's those two books.
So your name is associated with it if I wanted to look for it.
Just look for it under the title, or you could look for it under one of the three editors is Tova Ganzel, Ganzel, a colleague at Bar Ilan. That's another way to find that. And The Bible and the Believer, it's Brettler, Enns, Enns, and Harrington, Harrington. And please don't only read my section. I think one of the wonderful things about this book is you could see how different religious traditions are struggling with the same issue. And yes, Aaron, please.
Thank you very much, Doctor. Totally fascinating. First, can we see the slide right before your conclusion? I think it was about modern orthodoxy.
Yes.
Okay, thank you. I have a screen grab of that. I look forward to analyzing all of this with my screenshots.
So all I will say, and I believe that the entire slideshow will be shared so
Ah,
that you should have access to that. But in 1 minute, Mordechai Breuer was, as you can see, somewhere between an Orthodox and an ultra-Orthodox Haredi Jew. He, born in Germany, named Breuer, a grandson of Samson Raphael Hirsch. And he at some point discovered biblical criticism, realized that the arguments of source criticism had to make sense. And here, notice what he says, the far-fetched harmonization that many people engage in is wrong compared to the brilliant work of Wellhausen and his associates. And he comes up with this amazing synthesis of saying, well, yes, the Torah is composite and not composites. God is so complicated that no single source can express the full nature of God, and therefore the Torah has all of God's written notions of the nature of God. And that's why it has these apparent contradictions, because the Godhead himself cannot be explained in a simple synthetic way. So that is Mordechai Breuer in one sentence. If you send
thank you. I
me an email,
appreciate it.
he has one article in English. I can point you to that article.
Thank you. And so my second, I really appreciate this a lot. Would you say then, Doctor, that is the most chronologically updated, just speaking in chronology, just speaking of modern times now, is that as far as Jewish tradition has gone for creating what Solomon Schechter and others have said that Torah will come from Israel? What's going to be the Jewish synthesis of it all? Is that the most thing right now?
There is no Jewish synthesis. So that is one of the newest Orthodox syntheses. There's actually one which is a little bit newer. There's been substantial pushback against Mordechai Breuer, but again, that is one of the newer ones. But all of the Israeli scholars, including many of them who are observant, have different sorts of syntheses. And to really see that, the book, The Believer, this is really the Jewish believer and the modern study of the Bible, will have additional syntheses. So one of the things that I simply like to say is so often when people talk about history of ideas, they want to see a clear line in a development. One of the things that has come out of the research that I've done, and have done with Professor Breuer of Hebrew University, this is part of a larger project, is there is no clear linear development of Jewish attitudes toward biblical scholarship. So that's why these different perspectives are so important. And I hope that different people will find particular different perspectives to be important, rather than necessarily following the latest.
We do have one last question from Steve. Is James Kugel Orthodox?
Yes, James Kugel is Orthodox. James Kugel, when I live in Jerusalem, he's across the street from me. I often see him walking either to or from Mincha Mariv in the late afternoon or early evening. He wears a nice black kippah. His Jewish observance is Orthodox. But then again, the word Orthodox is a problematic word. I would highly advise having a session here on when did Orthodoxy really start, the development of Orthodoxy. This is a newer idea. I'll just say that Orthodox really means standard belief, from Greek doxos. People now talk about orthoprax rather than orthodox. So all I'll say is, in terms of the Jewish practice, James Kugel is certainly orthoprax. In some of his other books, he certainly shows some very significant sympathy to biblical criticism. Yet he, like many other people, I might be in that group. The Hebrew University Israeli scholar Baruch Schwartz is certainly in that group, have found ways, and I discuss some of that in The Bible and the Believer, in which we are able to subscribe to much of the standard belief of biblical criticism, source criticism, text criticism, and others, while still maintaining Orthodox lifestyle. So to give you a very simple example, going back, I think that the better reading in Genesis chapter 2, verse 2 is Vayechal Elohim Bayom HaShishi. God finished on the sixth day. But when I recite Kiddush every Friday night, which I do, I recite it as Vayichal Elohim Bayom HaShavi'i. I do not use that amended text in a liturgical context. So that's the best way I can answer that question.
And this is the last question that we have. This is from Austin. I studied Elliot Friedman's work, James Kugel's, and yours, but one thing I haven't seen addressed is what decisions and influences impacted the redaction of the Tanakh and theory by Ezra. In particular, he had to know that there was a duplication and inconsistencies, right?
So, as they say in Hebrew, on one foot, al regel achat. Let me just explain the question. According to source criticism, the Torah is composite from, let's say, usually 4 or more sources, which have contradictions. We saw this in the narrative, for example, the 2 creation stories, the 2 Noah stories. We saw this in the legal material, where the different ideas of Exodus and Deuteronomy versus Leviticus of when the Hebrew slave goes free. So Austin is assuming that the Torah was put together by Ezra. Not everybody would agree with it, but he's asking, like, how did it happen that this came together, given that it has all these differences? I talk about that a little bit in my book, How to Read the Jewish Bible, but I'll say very quickly here, I think that the compiler or compilers or editors were aware of these differences, but they were also aware that they were trying to bring together and hold together different social groups in ancient Israel, each of which had what I would call a proto-Torah. And one of the ways of doing it is saying, I am going to incorporate your text, and I am going to incorporate your text. And yes, I know it's contradictory, but it is more important to be inclusive than to have a perfectly consistent text. By the way, that is a lesson that I believe has contemporary relevance as well.
Well, thank you again so much, Dr. Marc Brettler, and thank you everyone for attending today's class. You can find more information about our upcoming classes on our website, and I hope everyone has a good rest of their day.
Thank you. It's been my pleasure.